has worked with such great groups like the American Center for Law and Justice, has been a long defender of the Constitution and our individual liberty, religious liberty, free speech. He's on the phone with me right now, currently with a feature story in this month's National Review magazine. It will be online next week, but it is in the magazine, the digital copy now, and then the actual copy will be on the newsstands, I believe, late this afternoon. David French, welcome to the program. Thank you for the story, I must say, but what made you want to write about Wisconsin's John Doe prosecutions? And then if you could explain, I think it's tremendous, but what made National Review make it a feature story?
Well, there's a couple of things that made me want to write about it. One, I've been following it for some time. The Wall Street Journal has done an outstanding job of following the legal twists and turns of the case. And then, over time, as you follow stories like this, you get to know some of the participants, some of the people who've been involved. Like I had spoken to Eric O'Keefe about the case. And I've been increasingly concerned about this phenomenon of the weaponization of law enforcement against political dissent in this country. And it's not just Wisconsin. It's happened in Texas. It's happened elsewhere. This Wisconsin John Doe proceeding, from a lawyer standpoint, and I'm a constitutional lawyer, was so egregious. I wanted to dive into it to understand it. And very importantly, I wanted to get the stories to the extent that I could of the actual targets of the investigation. So far, the discussion about this has concentrated on legal ramifications, legal twists and turns. But these were real people impacted by these investigations, and I wanted to hear their real-world experience.
So we always describe this as, people experienced pre-dawn paramilitary style raids. That doesn't really paint a picture. I mean, it does a little bit, but what you do in this story is, for instance, you start with the story of Cindy Archer, she was one of the few people who actually allowed herself to be named. She talked about having the police show up at her door. She wasn't dressed. She was begging them to let her secure her dogs as they were barking because she was so worried her dogs would be shot by police. They drag all of her stuff out into the middle of her yard. It's this kind of stuff. And is that an experience you found over and over, similar with other targets of the...
Over and over, for people who talked on the record and off the record, it was the same. The early morning pounding on the door, the yelling, the police pouring into the house, family members, in some cases, children woken up with the police standing over them, family members being moved into a room where in one case, particularly vivid, an investigator taunted the members of the family. Imagine that. It's the earliest morning hours, and you've got police swarming through your house, and a law enforcement officer is literally taunting you like you see happen on movies. They're not even allowed to read the search warrant often until well into the search, so they don't even know if what's been taken is within the scope of the search warrant or not in the scope of the search warrant. And then here's the part that had the real long-term negative consequence, as if being essentially having your home invaded isn't a negative consequence enough in the moment. You had a long-term negative consequence in that they were told in no uncertain terms, you cannot tell anyone about this. You can't call your lawyer right now. You can't tell your mother. You can't tell your father. The kids can't tell people at school as to what happened, even though school buses drive by and see these homes surrounded by police. So they couldn't tell anyone. And that matters in two ways. Number one, it leaves the cloud of suspicion on this family with nothing they can do about it, because a raid is a very public act. It's not like you can secretly raid a house when you're surrounding it, putting floodlights on it, police going in and out for hours. That's a public act. But then when the secrecy imposed on the family and on everyone in the family, what that means is they can't defend themselves. They can't say this was politics. They can't say this was retribution for supporting Act 10 or conservative causes. They can say nothing. And then the other thing that's terrible about this is, I'm sorry, but a raid in your home is a traumatic act. I mean, think about that for your own life. Imagine your home is raided by law enforcement under illegitimate pretext. That's a traumatic act. And they can't even talk about that traumatic act. They can't go through a process of healing, of a process of dealing with this in a way that everyone else can when they go through terrible circumstances. They are denied that. So the process, as Eric O'Keefe said in an interview, the process becomes the punishment. It didn't matter that ultimately there was nothing there, that the quote unquote crimes being investigated. In all likelihood, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, if the Wisconsin Supreme Court rules the way I believe the Constitution dictates that it should rule, that these crimes being investigated were not crimes at all. Never mind that. Never mind that they were cleared. Never mind that there was nothing even there to begin with. They went through a horrific experience because of their politics.
And there's no way for them to, so far, there's no way for them to claim any kind of damages or find any way to make it right. I'm looking at the story. You're using pseudonyms for most people here, but the story you shared of Anne, it sounded like she didn't even know it was police. Just all of a sudden, there's just
right.
in the early morning hours, just people busting into her house. I got to tell you, David, if that happened to me, I'd grab a gun. I can't even imagine how this could have gone so horribly, tragically wrong. Given what they were doing and how they were behaving, and how it was so chaotic and difficult to understand the situation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was trying to put myself in their shoes as I was hearing their story, and imagine your early morning hours, and there's just this loud pounding on the door. I mean, the way Anne described it is, her first thought was, it's a matter of life or death. That she thought someone was dying outside the house. It was that loud, that insistent that it was an emergency. That's dangerous. That is incredibly dangerous. And for the police to choose that tactic meant that they were choosing to risk people's lives here. I live in Tennessee, and many homes, mine included, we exercise our Second Amendment rights. And we have a castle doctrine in our state, for example, and someone pounding on your door, preparing to come storming in, that's creating a dangerous situation. And for what? That's the thing that I think is really important to get across here. These people were not dangerous. This was not pounding to get in because there was a life or death situation inside. This was pounding to get in as an act of intimidation. You could just as easily, during the day, politely knock, provide a search warrant, and enter the home if the search warrant was lawful. And one of the points that I think is interesting about this is that the rubber stamp that the judge gave to prosecution requests to search homes and to search electronic records, it was just remarkable. So I think these warrants themselves were unconstitutional, but even presuming they were constitutional, there is a manner in which you can serve a search warrant that does not put someone in fear for their life and make their children feel that their home is no longer a safe place.
We're going to take a quick break here and be back with the rest of the interview with David French, who helped to explode the John Doe story here in Wisconsin nationwide. We'll be right back. All right, we're going to conclude my interview with David French, again, with National Review Magazine, who, and we can't, Wisconsin knows I'm a debt of gratitude, exploded a story, allowed a story on the John Doe investigation that I've been talking about for a year, Matt Kittle's been writing about for a year, to escape containment of our state and alternative media. Here's the rest of David French. No kidding. And by the way, you describe this as well. They still think this way. I mean, they still wonder, when police drive by, whether they're coming for their house. And even though, for all intents and purposes, the use value of this particular John Doe, this particular investigation, it has been diminished, at least with regard to the gubernatorial election, because that was the purpose of this. They don't know whether their information could be used again or they could be targeted again. Furthermore, and beyond just the sort of personal, terror that people experience for no good reason, as you say, it could have been very easy to serve a polite warrant. Oh, by the way, I have this. I need to get, your computer, whatever, whether it's lawful or not. At least they could have been polite about it. Is that the intention was to dry up campaign donations or more specifically, donations to independent groups, and it worked beautifully. Donations just disappeared.
Oh, absolutely, it worked because the one of the things that's so pernicious about the John Doe, and this is what I try to explain in the article, is when the victims of the investigation, the target of the investigation, are unable to speak, then the rest of the community is left with a cloud of suspicion with no real ability to discern the legitimacy of the investigation. So the prosecution, and to be clear, I reached out to the district attorney's office for comment. They refused comment. The prosecution was able to engage in public acts indicating extreme levels of suspicion of criminal behavior. A raid, as I said earlier, a raid is a very public act, and when you do a raid with armed officers, pre-dawn hours, lights, it looks very bad in a community. That is the kind of thing you do to drug dealers. When you have a public act that indicates suspicion, but then you prohibit the target from explaining the situation or defending themselves, you're creating a cloud of suspicion they cannot dispel. And so other people around them rationally take precautions. Would you give money to an institution that had just been raided by armed officers? Of course
no
not.
way.
People don't do that. They send their money elsewhere. So that's the way that the prosecutor was able to use the John Doe process to create its own punishment. And I think that's very clear for people, that people need to understand. And this legal regime, this John Doe legal regime, is one of the most subject to abuse legal mechanisms I've ever seen in my career as a constitutional lawyer. It is hard to imagine that it exists in the United States of America.
And it exists, as I understand, 2 states have John Doe laws. We're one of 2, and ours is even worse than, and I haven't looked at the entire details, but ours has been described as the most abusive or most ripe for abuse, and now we know it's the most abusive. David, who made the decision to execute the warrants the way they were executed at pre-dawn hours with Klieg lights blazing into people's windows, terrifying women? You know, one woman described she wasn't even allowed to wake up her kids. Armed police officers scaring the hell out of little kids. Who made the decision that the raids were going to be conducted, that raids were going to be conducted at all?
Well, that is a very good question. And it's one, unless the law enforcement officers themselves will speak on the record, we can't get a precise answer. But, one of the things, you can look at some subtle differences from raid to raid to know that the police didn't conduct themselves the same way every time. So, for example, with Cindy Archer, they actually brought a battering ram to it, a battering ram. The other 2 women who spoke did not mention a battering ram. There was no reference to that. And one of them said that it appeared that the lead officer on the scene there was embarrassed by what she was doing. And she even said to the family when they were about to leave, "Some days I hate my job." So it's apparent that police made different decisions in different locations. And so my at this point, the informed conjecture is that the police had some degree of autonomy over how they conducted the raid itself, even if they didn't necessarily have autonomy over the timing. So some raids were more extreme than others. There was the battering ram in one case. Cindy Archer talks about how the police walked in on her partner who was in the shower. There was, in another one, officers go into rooms with sleeping children. So these things are variable, but we don't ultimately know who made the call. You go at pre-dawn, bring a battering ram, conduct yourself in this manner. We don't know and can't know until we hear from some of the officers involved. And as I said, I reached out to the district attorney, and they flatly refused any comment on the raid tactics or on the John Doe, any other aspect of the John Doe.
We do know, however, that these raids were conducted across multiple counties, Milwaukee County and Dane County. There were 3 other counties that were involved. So these raids, and people experienced this sort of terror in multiple locations. So part of me says there was an order to go pre-dawn, with perhaps sheriff's departments, using their own policies to execute those raids. But people across different counties were experiencing similar terrifying experiences here. Again,
exactly.
Remember what this was all for. This was all based on an interpretation that being part of an independent expenditure group that supported policies that Governor Walker supported was somehow in violation of Chapter 11 campaign finance law. And if that were even true, David, you still need to explain why you're bringing a battering ram to Cindy Archer's house. That is a story you can all download right now at nationalreview.com. It's still there on the front page. Read it. Read it. Share it with your friends. That's happening in Wisconsin.